All right, good morning, everybody. So it was brought to my attention by multiple students that my last video didn't have audio, and so somehow I shifted. You might notice my background's a little different. So I shifted my desk from point A to point B in my classroom, and in the move, my software settings somehow I use OBS to record, and my settings on my OBS audio kind of either were reset or got screwed up somehow. So my last video had no audio. So I was gonna recap what I did in that video. Now, if you followed along, you could have probably just followed along without audio, and maybe you could have done okay. But at the beginning of this video here, July 17th, 23, I'm going to go through what I did in my last video at a high level and just kind of recap it to get everyone at least started on this assignment, because this is, again, very individual assignment, whereas I can kind of get you started, but then you guys are going to have to take the skills that you learned in your first year, really the front end skills with HTML, CSS, to kind of build the interface that you're looking for. Because of course we're doing this in React, and that's what we're doing. We're building a front end. And so, here in live time, I've really given about 2 classroom days to work on this. And so we're talking about, we do 7-hour days. So we're talking about 14 hours, more or less, that I'm asking Grant, who's attending live, to kind of put into working on the front end and making it look good. Again, we're getting into the front end, we're getting into React. I always talk about, the importance of this project, importance of this bug tracker project, and to get into the importance of how the website looks. So as someone who's been a teacher for a long time, I've seen basically 2 camps of students. I've seen the camps of students that really care about their front end and making a beautiful looking site. And I've seen the camps of students that say, well, I just want to focus on the functionality. I'm not creative, therefore I don't care as much what the site looks like. What I would advise is anyone who's in that second camp that says, well, I'm just not creative and I really just care about functionality. In general, that's not what end users want. Obviously end users want beautiful interfaces, and beautiful can also mean simple. I'm not against simple interfaces. If you look at Apple and what they've done with a lot of their software, that's part of the beauty in Apple products, is that they are good looking, of course, but they are simple to use. And so maybe beautiful means simple, but it is important, even if you don't identify as someone who is creative, to put effort into the look of your application, because at the end of the day, you will be judged and your software will be perceived by its looks as much, if not more, than its functionality. Of course it has to function, but that doesn't mean you can ignore how it looks. And so if you're one of the people that care about the looks, and that's kind of your native stance, and you're going to enjoy this, because this lab is literally like go to work and make a beautiful looking interface. But if you find yourself as like, hey, I'm not that creative and I don't really care as much, this will be harder for you. My advice for those people who aren't artistic, and I would kind of lump myself into that category. In this world of technology, you will never know it all. There's always skills. You're going to look to pick up more and more skills over time. The design skill might not be something you find yourself natural at. Therefore, what I choose to do in many cases is I choose to outsource my design. And so there are all sorts of, and if you were my student in the first year, you know that I'm a believer in templates. And so that was part of the lecture last week, is I kind of go into all the available Bootstrap templates that are out there. And so let's see if I can I have so many favorites anymore. Let me see where my templates might be. Bootstrap. Okay, so under this Bootstrap folder here, you could see I've got, of course, startbootstrap.com. Here's some other ones. Black Tie, which are Bootstrap themes. Bootstrapius, Bootswatch, Template Mag, Bootstrap Templates. Here's one, Template Monster, that's pretty good. And so you can get into stuff like Template Monster. Now, by no means am I saying you have to or that you should pay for a template. There are enough free resources out there. In fact, let me make it clear, don't pay for anything here. Okay, but if you're developing professional sites and you're getting paid for professional sites, especially then, that's when it might make sense to pay for a template. And so you can kind of get into here and find Bootstrap templates. And this is just one site. Again, of course, a little Google search will bring up all sorts of links that you can, 1,400 free Bootstrap templates. The nature of this is you're going to come across a lot of them that are, I made the point on last Friday. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a student portfolio use like this template. Like there's popular ones, right? And that's the downfall of using a template, is if you pick a popular one, it's like, I've probably seen no less than 50 student portfolios built using this free template. It's a good template, but it's so common that it's like, someone probably can identify, But if you change it enough, you change enough backgrounds, you change enough colors, maybe you can't identify it. So that's a downfall of using a template. When it comes to these forms, again, you can do your own research here, finding a free Bootstrap template, and that's fine. A little bit of research goes a long way. Bootstrap login form template, and so you can just do this kind of search, and on a very simple search, you can get some of these components that we're going to be building in, and it looks good fonts, good images, good icons. Now we're gonna have to learn how to do icons in Bootstrap, but okay, so that's kind of the first part, is hey, you can kind of come into here and find a template that maybe this is generic enough, it's a good gradient, maybe you change the colors, maybe you change some fonts, but this is a really good starting point. You can go show code, and there you have it. Now keep in mind, every time you see the word class on these templates, you're going to have to change it in React to class name. And every time you see the keyword for, like here's input label for, is HTML4. So if you keep those couple things in mind, also, you want to make sure that all your tags are either self-closing or have a closing tag, because the JSX X representing XML is pretty strict. One of the rules in XML is that every opening tag must have a closing tag, whereas HTML, you know, doesn't have that strict of a rule. Okay. Going into the lab a little bit more, you're going to go ahead and create a new repository. You're going to share that repository with me. You're going to build, you're going to use the Create React App template to kind of boot up everything that's needed and bring in all the dependencies for React. Again, I think in the future I might be changing this. There's enough that I've seen and read now that there's just better tooling out there, even for beginners. And so, like, we used a tool called Vite. If you followed along last week with Web Dev Simplified, I might just transition this to a tool like that. But for now, we can use Create React App. It's going to be totally fine. Removed unused example code, so it's just like we just did Hello World. If you watched my lecture last week, we did Hello World. We went through and we installed Bootstrap a little bit differently. And so you're going to notice Bootstrap, I brought it in as a dependency. So if I go into node modules, we installed Bootstrap, npm I bootstrap, or npm install Bootstrap. That's a command that you run. And now you can see Bootstrap is a dependency that we brought in with npm. That allows us to, on our index, you're going to notice we are now importing Bootstrap CSS and we're importing Bootstrap JS. And we're kind of providing a relative link here, a relative path to our Bootstrap resources. And so that is something that we did a little bit differently to bring in Bootstrap in that manner. Now, why did we do that? Well, the main reason that I chose to do it this way was because if you've been following along, we deployed a backend to Google Cloud, and we just mocked up a really dummy front end, and we were having some security issues bringing in the CDN. And it's like, well, instead of bringing a CDN, you could just link to it locally. And so that's the easy solution. Just link to it locally instead of using the CDN. Now, alternatively, I could have, continued to troubleshoot that and fix that problem, which is totally fine. I could have done that, but instead we just bring it in locally, and that solves the problem just as well. So I brought in Bootstrap a little bit differently than I did during the lecture. These other dependencies, I touched on this. You can install them, and we will be using these dependencies. We've already used Lodash a little bit. We've already used NanoID a little bit. And then Axios is basically what's around the corner. And so tomorrow on the 18th, I will do another lecture where we bring in Axios. And Axios is the library, it's the dependency that's going to tie in our front end to our back end. And so it's, in my experience, Axios is not very difficult to learn, and it really makes that, that process of tying in the front end to the back end with all of our forms and button clicks and submits and all that kind of fun stuff, it simplifies it quite a bit. And so, whether you install that now or you install it later, it's coming. So no big deal. You can install those dependencies now or you can install them later. If you don't install them now, they're coming. Then went on to talk about, screen mockups. And kind of the concept behind screen mockups and prototyping in general is you kind of want to start with the end in mind. It's kind of a goal-driven mindset to like, hey, where do I want to finish? Before I start writing any code, let me build up a prototype. And one tool for doing that is called Balsamiq. I went through on the video and I showed you how to download and install Balsamiq wireframes. And then here is a license key. If you go to like the help menu, I believe, you can plug in a license and that'll get you good till the end of the year. And again, what you're doing, this is a drag and drop tool. It literally takes 5 minutes of just exploring the tool, of kind of figuring out how to drag and drop the different controls to make a screen mock-up. And so again, in software development, it is very common, especially with larger projects, to kind of start with the end in mind, do a screen mock-up, and then that becomes a communication tool to managers and to stakeholders and to people who are using the software. It's like, hey, this is what I'm thinking of building, give me some feedback. And so it becomes much more iterative. You don't have to write a single line of code. They can actually critique you and improve what they want, because ultimately you're building this software for someone else in 99% of cases. So they can give you feedback and move this control over here, change this color, change this font. And they can give you feedback before you have to write a little bit of code. Therefore, your response time to giving them what they want is shortened. So this is a good thing for you to go through. Now, I made this optional. You can kind of do these different screen mock-ups. Again, I think it's a good practice, especially when you're building something for someone else. But, it is an optional thing if you want to do it in this class. Then we get into, okay, let's actually implement some components. Now, in here, what I'm really asking for in this lab, okay, and the instructions might not match this completely, is I'm asking you to build the front end, and then I do want state variables for all the different pieces of information. And so, start making some state variables to handle usernames and passwords and bugs. Store a bug in a state variable, so on and so forth. And so I'm not super concerned with the functionality right now, because we have a little bit more learning to do, and ultimately any functionality that we would implement today, we would just have to refactor in its final form. So it would just be an exercise of wiring up event handlers or event listeners, and maybe some, writing some vanilla JavaScript logic to pretend like we're doing logins, but we're not doing logins yet. So it's going to be, we're going to flush this out, in other words, when we actually learn how to tie in that back end. So it says we will discuss how to interface our APIs and databases next week. So for right now, use local state and arrays to implement the functionality. Again, I'm not super concerned about the functionality. Right now, it's just about building the forms, building the components, building the controls, maybe wiring up some event handlers, getting your state ready, getting the state variables ready to store information, and that's where we're at. Now, to get into the code a little bit, if I go into what I wrote last week, ultimately we've got the root component called the app component, and so I left the index app basically unchanged. And so when you go into app, you can notice I did put a folder called components, and so that's just an organizational thing to put all my custom components in a folder called components. And so when I bring in the login form, I now have to navigate into the components folder, and that enables me to have this custom component called login form. The only thing that's also a little bit different, I just did some custom markup here. I have a class called container. That's a Bootstrap class called container. It gives you what's typically called a wrapper around your content. That's going to be responsive in nature. Inside of my container, I have one child here that I made a flex box, and so I showed in this video. So outermost parent is container, one child in there. That child is a flex box that I told it to be a flex column, and I said, hey, take up 100% vertical height. And so if you remember flex box, here we have 3 flex items or 3 children. By default, flex box is going to flex horizontally, and I said, no, let's go ahead and flex it up and down vertically in a column. And I have one child that says header, another one called main, and another one called footer. So I have 3 flex items inside of my flex box. And the kind of the trick that I put here, which is a fun trick, is flex grow of 1. And so when you set the parent to be 100% vertical height, and then you tell the main content to flex grow 1, the way that works is that header will take up as much space as it needs, vertical space. Footer will also take up as much vertical space it will need. And then main will take up all the remaining space in between. And so main is very flexible in size. It's going to take up all the remaining space that header doesn't take and that footer doesn't take. This is a very simple trick for getting a sticky footer. And so if I kind of boot this up, npm run, I think it's dev maybe? I always get my run commands, npm run start. npm run start. It's a very simple way to get a sticky footer. And so, again, main's kind of taking up whatever space in between. If I actually go to my inspect tool and I kind of click on header, you can see how much space header is taking up. You can see main is taking up all the remaining space, and then footer, right now even footer is at the bottom because the console is taking up, well, about half my screen right now, but it's basically always going to be at the bottom. So it's kind of a fun little trick. I thought I'd show that off there, using Flexbox to make a sticky footer. And I kind of mentioned last week that, as web developers, some of the most simple tasks like getting something centered or getting something stuck at the bottom, it's not always as simple as you would probably assume. Just getting something in the middle is actually more complex until you find a tool like Flexbox. Flexbox is really one of the best tools out there to get content centered and to make everything responsive and to get things like sticky footers. And I kind of mentioned that, in the web development world, there's all these memes out there about, getting things centered. And I literally was scrolling through Instagram, and he said, what does this guy says? I was scrolling through Instagram later that night, and it's like me realizing I still can't center a div and this little cartoon guy. I don't even know what cartoon this is from. Grant, any idea?
I don't know.
Yeah. Anyways.
What am I doing with my life?
What am I doing with my life? Anyways, it's just, the point is, I was literally earlier that day, I was talking about that very topic, and there came the Instagram meme. What am I doing with my life? And so I found that funny. So then what? So then we're inside of app. We bring in the login form. So I made a component called loginform.js. And here's kind of where I'm at with because of the recording. If you wanted to just kind of code along with it, you could very well just follow the video and just write the code that I write. but I'm going to explain it at a high level here. And so even if you already coded this video, of course you could just pause this video now and write the code verbatim. But I'm going to explain it at a high level now. So again, app calls login form. There's our one component. This lab, all you're doing is creating a bunch of components. You're creating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 components. And so I've created one component as a demonstration, and then the rest of these components will ultimately be up to you. A lot of our backend may be similar in nature, but your front end should be completely different. All of the students should have a completely different looking and at least different looking front end. And so I did make a very simple login form to walk through that component. I brought in use state, of course. It's all one function. So if you kind of look at the basic components, we have our import at the top. We have our function, which is ultimately our component, and then we export that function. And so that's kind of what we have going on. Now, if I go into the markup, the one thing that you have to remember to do is inside the function, you have a return block of code, return, and then in parentheses, and this is where your JSX goes. Your JSX is going to be a combination of HTML and these curly brackets. Anytime you see the curlies or curly braces, that represents a little bit of JavaScript being interjected. And so I just have a form element. It's important to remember your form controls. Anytime you have a text box, anytime you have a checkbox, it is considered semantic HTML that you always put those inside of a form. And so it won't validate if you have form controls that are not inside of a form. So don't forget your form because it's important for semantic HTML. And you're going to notice that my form tag is, I left off all the normal attributes that belong on there, the action attribute and the method attribute, because we're not going to be using the defaults as far as how these forms are submitted. Instead, we're going to be using Axios. And so inside of my form, you can kind of see I just have some Bootstrap rows. So it looks like I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. And keep in mind that your JSX has to have one parent element. And so my one parent element is my form tag. Keep in mind there has to be one root. That's another rule of XML, is there has to be one root element. And so JSX, you have to have that one root element. And so in my top row, I basically have a single column that is about a third of the screen with a label and a text box. Now in this label, again, HTML4 and class name. So the HTML4 has to match the ID of my text box. The things that I find interesting here are the autocomplete. That is one way that I would really encourage you guys to kind of modernize your forms by being familiar with the autocomplete attribute and all of the different values that can be auto-completed. And so, nowadays, especially as a user of a form, you pretty much expect this, right? You expect that the browser can just auto-complete. You fill out your first name and it fills out everything else for you. And so really recommend for you guys to be familiar and implement these autocomplete attributes on all of your form controls. And they're fairly straightforward. You got postal codes and credit card given name, credit card number, credit card expiration, Birthday is a full date, birthday is a day, month, and year, so on and so forth. So definitely recommend checking out this MDN article and just being familiar of the article itself, so that anytime you're working on forms, you just keep this article pulled up and fill out all those autocompletes. Then the other one is placeholder. Of course, placeholder is the gray text that is there. Now, the user clicks, and as soon as they start to type, that placeholder goes away. Which is different than a value. A value is kind of a default value that's there, and it says enter email address, and it's a little shade of gray. And so because we're savvy users, we understand that the placeholder is not the same thing as a value that's actually entered in there, but don't assume your end users know the difference. And so I tend to just give them instructions like enter email address versus doing something like demo@email.com. Even though I think there is some value to explaining your expectations there, just giving them, this is almost like redundant instructions here. But again, I just the difference between that gray text and the black text is so small that I think it can be confusing to users. So just something to keep in mind. What else then? So email address, and then here I said on change, set email. So I did set up 4 hooks here called use state. A hook is just a method that has a specific purpose in React. And so there are a few different hooks that we'll use in this class. Again, it's just, when you hear the term hook, it's just a React term. It doesn't really mean anything that I know of outside of React. And again, it's just a function that has a specific purpose in this tool. So this is called the use state hook, or the use state function. And what this is doing is, it's maintaining our state with this variable called email, and a way of modifying that with set email. And so kind of down here we say, hey, whenever the user changes anything in that text box, call this set email function and pass in that text box's value, right? So EVT current target dot value. And same thing with password, and I showed that, hey, you can call it EVT current target value or EVT target dot value. Two different JavaScript properties that all navigate to basically the same piece of data. So this is how we're setting the email, setting the password, and then I made a little function here called onLogin. So notice here's my function onLogin. So when they click the login button, we call this function onLogin. We prevent the default, which is submitting the form. We clear out our error messages, and we say, hey, if they give us a good username and password, then we're going to set this variable called success to welcome. Otherwise, we're going to set an error message that says invalid username or password. So I did wire up some functionality here. Again, it's not a critical part of the lab to do this, but I just wanted to show how to do it, because there are instructions in the lab that says do this or do that. And it's like, well, we can just write a little bit of, vanilla JavaScript if-else statement using these variables email and current password. And admin@example.com, I think is what I said. Yep, and regular old password. If I click login, it's going to say welcome, but if I add another character, we get that. And so this is just a way of, wiring up some fake functionality for the time being. So that's what I did last Friday, in a nutshell. Last Thursday. And What I'm asking all of you to do is wire up or create the rest of these components and begin to implement some styling and how you might want to style these components. Right now my header and footer, there's nothing to them, and I've got no images, and my website is a prime example of what not to do when it comes to design. So I'm asking you to spend a little bit more time on the front end and maybe spice it up a little bit, because at the end of the day you want a good looking bug tracker for presentation. And so again, kind of giving 14 or so classroom hours to work on this before we continue on. Grant, as he has been all semester, is kind of walking through it, and we can kind of walk through Grant's implementation of the rest of the components. At any point in time, I'm just going to go ahead and pause this recording, and then when I come back from the break, we'll go through Grant's, we'll just call it his first draft of his front end, because again, it's a work in progress. It's going to be far from complete what he shows you, but it will be his first draft. Whew, all right. So Grant, if you're here, you ready to get to work?
Yeah, sounds good.
Any questions, comments, or concerns?
Nope, not right now.
All right, man. We'll get to work. I'll pause the video. When we come back, we'll go over your code.
Okay.
All righty, thanks.